right, good afternoon, and welcome, and thank you all for coming to our first event of the School of Law's Natural Resources Speaker Series for 2012. We are very fortunate to have Professor Barbara Cosens here from the University of Idaho College of Law. This is the second year that we have done the Natural Resources Speaker Series. Last year, we had a really kind of a varied group of attorneys from New Mexico, and to kick off this year's series, we brought in a ringer from Moscow, and we didn't have to go far actually, because Barbara is spending the semester here at the Utton Transboundary Resources Center. She's on sabbatical from U of I. So we've been fortunate to have her here for much of the semester, and she's been fortunate to enjoy the lovely weather of the Duke City in the wintertime. So Barbara joined the law faculty at the University of Idaho in 2004, where she now holds the rank of full professor. Before she started teaching, she had a career with the state of Montana, doing water right negotiations involving federal and tribal claims, which prepared her well for her later scholarship and for some of the things that we'll hear about tonight. At Idaho, she is the principal investigator on development of the new Water Resources graduate program that involves both joint JD Masters and JD PhD degrees. She represents U of I on the university's consortium on Columbia River governance. And her research interests include the integration of law and science in water resource management and dispute resolution, water management and resilience, and the recognition and settlement of Native American water rights. So she will be talking this evening about the Walker River negotiations, where she served as mediator. Before we hear from Barbara, I need to do a couple of preliminaries first. Certainly want to thank the people who made this possible, the Natural Resources Environmental Law Program here at the law school, the Utton Transboundary Resources Center, particularly Kendall Alexander, who did a lot of the work in putting this event together. Also the Natural Resources Journal and the Environmental Law Society. And finally, we need to thank the Natural Resources, Energy, and Environmental Law section of the New Mexico State Bar, which has generously provided some financial support for this speaker series. So thanks to all of those entities, and also want to mention, if you are a New Mexico attorney here seeking CLE credit for attending this program, please sign one of the sheets in the back. There are sheets in either corner, so sign in and include your bar number. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Barbara Cosens. I should mention that in addition to all the other great things I said before, she is an award-winning teacher, a committed endurance athlete. Would you say that's a fair characterization? A committed endurance athlete?
A retiring committed.
All right. And I would say, over the last decade, she has really produced some of the more interesting and relevant legal scholarship on water issues of anyone, particularly regarding approaches to complex, high-stakes, multi-sovereign disputes that are some of the most difficult problems to solve. And both her practice background and her scholarship, I think, will give her a lot of interesting things to say on this topic. So with that, please welcome Barbara Cosens.
Well, thank you, Reed, and thank you all for being here, and thank you for the sponsors. I'm going to begin by telling you a little bit about what I'm doing here working with the Utton Center. Basically, we have a collaboration. In addition to being at the College of Law at the University of Idaho, I work in an interdisciplinary program called Water and to the west. And through that, I'm collaborating with the Utton Center, the Earth Data Analysis Center, which is over in geography, the UNM Library, and the American Indian Law Center to develop an online searchable database on Native American water rights settlements. And it's an important goal to put all of that material online, both because these are historical documents that are not easily available, are not going to be readily available. People, and a lot of us who have worked on these settlements are getting fairly gray and getting to the point of retiring. And so we'll lose that information. But it's also a wealth of information to look to understand and get creative ideas on how to settle these complex water disputes, whether they involve Native American water rights or whether they are water disputes involving other issues. And so as Reed said, I was a mediator on the Walker River negotiations, and I'll show you with a map where those are located and a little bit about it. And what I'm going to talk about, those negotiations failed. They did not result in a settlement. But I'm going to use them as an example of some of the creative problem solving that people bring to the table. And then I'm going to use their failure to talk about the importance of a really robust public involvement process. And I'll give you at least my experience on how you design something like that when you have a large population within the basin that you're trying to bring together around a settlement. And so, you know, I called my talk just to see if I could interest a few people, opportunities for achieving integrated water resource management, because that was the sort of creative solution that people were gelling around in the Walker River. But I thought, well, if I'm going to talk about that here, since integrated water resource management is quite the buzzword these days, I need to begin by defining it. And I loved one of the articles I found that said, basically, no one has an idea what this concept means, and that the vagueness has contributed to its popularity because you can basically do whatever you want with it. And so I decided that is what I would do, and I would define it in the way I think appropriate. It is, if you look at definitions of integrated water resource management, they have two themes running through them, and one is sort of a reduction in the fragmentation, regulatory fragmentation that we see, either because of jurisdictional boundaries, which all of our water resources cross, or because of sort of authority boundaries. So one agency handles one aspect of water management, another agency handles another aspect. And this fragmentation is extremely frustrating for people who are interested in water resources, whether they are water users, whether they are environmental groups interested in it, whether they are Native American tribes seeking to define and develop their water rights. And so it's something that can actually, trying to achieve greater collaboration, greater coordination in this area, can bring people to the table. And the other thing about it is you're not, when you have this sort of array or fragmentation of regulation at the federal, state, tribal, and local level, we're not going to wipe the slate clean and say, oh, let's now organize all our governance around a water basin. You know, that would be nice, but it's not politically realistic. We're not going to do something like that. And so rather than trying to have a wholesale answer to the problem of fragmentation, bringing it into processes of dispute resolution so that people can work together to tailor an approach that will work within their basin is actually a really good way to approach it. The other aspect of integrated water resource management is the need for strong public involvement, and that tends to be in a lot of the places you look at attempts at integrated water resource management tend to be in developing countries where there hasn't been a lot of public involvement in the past. So it's usually articulated as a way to increase equity, a way to increase local involvement. western water basins, it's really when you're trying to overlay better coordination on something that looks like this, it's the only way you're going to achieve it. You're not going to do it from the top down. You're going to do it from the bottom up. And so I'm going to use that to talk about how you design public involvement. So let me begin by going to the Walker River and just illustrating for you what the array of issues that people interested in that river basin were facing. And so this is a map of the Walker River. This is the border between California and Nevada. So California and Nevada takes a turn, the border takes a turn right at Lake Tahoe. And the West and East Walker River come together to form the Walker River. They head water in California, come out, go into Nevada, and terminate in Walker Lake. And it's the drainage just south of the Carson River, goes into Carson Sink, and the Truckee River that goes into Pyramid Lake. It's the drainage just north of Mono Lake, and that geography will become important as I talk about this. Interestingly, well, if I was talking about this in Montana or Idaho, this would be interestingly. Actually, here in New Mexico, you are accustomed to adjudication of water rights, some of the water rights in federal court. But in some of the other states I've worked, it all gets done in state court. This is an instance where it was done in federal court quite some time ago. And the reason they went to federal court was because the river crosses the state line, so they needed a federal forum. The water rights, the adjudication was filed in 1913 and in 1930, relatively rapidly by today's standards. For adjudication, a decree was issued, but that decree was not comprehensive. It dealt with the existing irrigation rights in the basin, and so I'll talk about the 3 Indian reservations within the basin. There was a little bit of irrigation on them, so it dealt with that, but not all of the rights. It didn't deal with any of the other federal rights, and it didn't address anything that might happen after the 1930s. Also, land has been added to one of the reservations within the basin, so that was another issue. So in 1994, the United States filed in federal court to reopen the decree. And in doing so, they asserted rights for the national forests in the basin, the national park in the basin, the BLM land in the basin, 2 military reservations within the basin, and 3 Native American reservations within the basin. So that's the start of the litigation, and I just want to show you some pictures to give you an idea what the basin looks at. This is the headwaters, rock and ice. It's national park, northern part of Yosemite National Park, and wilderness areas. Not a lot of water development in that area, although some minor diversions occur within the area, but most of it is water for the forest and wilderness that claims to be for in-stream flow. You come down out of the High Sierra first into a very high valley, the Bridgeport Valley. And the water use in that valley is for irrigation, mainly for hay and grazing. And also the Bridgeport Indian Colony is within that valley. One of the other unusual uses within the basin is the National Marine Mountain Warfare Training Center is located in the headwaters of the basin in California. And well, basically, when this guy comes to the table, basically everyone just says, whatever you want, that's fine. But it turns out that for a mountain warfare training center, the uses are compatible with the other uses in the headwaters of in-stream flow. Basically, except for very minor consumptive use on the military reservation, they want the water to remain in place. They want frozen lakes, frozen ice falls, avalanches, all of the things that you need to teach someone survival in this very harsh environment. There's a little bit of irrigation within California, so up in the Bridgeport Valley and a valley called the Antelope Valley, which is right below the Marine Warfare Training Center. But interestingly, the 2 reservoirs that serve much larger irrigation that occurs in Nevada. Both are partially within California. So you have sort of not only two states sharing the watershed, but a two-state irrigation district. So I'm going to kind of work my way. I started in the headwaters, work my way down the river. And so at this point, we're at the state line. And even though the federal court decree allocated water as between individuals, it did not apportion water as between the two states. And that's particularly important for any new development. And back in the 1970s, California and Nevada negotiated an interstate agreement for the allocation of water not only on the Walker River, but on the Carson and the Truckee Rivers. They took it to Congress because the Constitution requires that Congress approve an interstate allocation. And it was rejected. And it was rejected because they had not taken into account any of the Native American water rights that were within the basin. And so you have Pyramid Lake Paiute to the north, Walker Lake Paiute to the south, and the other two reservations within the Walker River Indian reservations had not been considered. Subsequently, in a negotiation that included the Native American water rights, the interstate allocation for the Carson and Truckee rivers had gone to Congress, but Walker River had never been apportioned. So that was one of the other issues facing the basin. As the river leaves here, you can sort of see in the relief on this that it's not just flat, there's some mountains in there, and it actually goes through some canyons before it bursts out into the two valleys that are heavily irrigated. And if any of you have studied reclamation law, you know that one of the other names given to the Reclamation Act, passed in 1903, is the Newlands Act. And that's because it was named after Senator Newlands, who was seeking development of the Newlands Project, which is on the Truckee and Carson rivers just north of this. Well, so you might imagine, given that geography, they were also looking at the Walker River. And Reclamation Service people were out there surveying the Walker River for development, and these canyons would be the perfect location for a dam to serve irrigation. But this is a really unusual irrigation district. It was very interesting working with them. They are an exception to the rule in the Western United States that our approach to the federal government is give us the money and get out. Their view was that they disliked the idea of federal involvement so much that they did not even want the money. And they developed their own irrigation project, and today it still runs without subsidy. According to the reclamation people that were on the federal team in the negotiations, it's one of the most efficient projects that they have ever worked with or got across the table from, I guess, in this case. River then goes out into the first of the valleys that it enters, which is fairly beautiful because you can still see the mountains from there. And so it's historically been alfalfa, but it is converting to a new crop, which is subdivisions. And so these changes within the valley certainly play a role in the issues that people bring to the table in negotiation. And then as the two forks of the Walker River come together, they go into a valley, the Mason Valley, that really has the high dollar value agriculture that is served by the project. And one way that they have been able to make it without subsidy, part of it is they've just very tightly controlled irrigation allocation, but also over the last couple decades, they've converted from things like alfalfa to high dollar value crops. So they're now growing onions and garlics and sweet potato. Higher dollar value crops, the other thing about them is they consume more water. So they're consuming more water, not only because of the crop type, but I think because they changed the method of irrigation. And one of the things about prior appropriation is that, at least in most states, your water right is defined for irrigation by the acreage that you irrigate, the rate at which you divert it, and sometimes plus or minus the volume that you've been diverting. There is no nothing preventing people to increase efficiency and therefore consume more of the water that they divert as long as they're within that water right. And in fact, Western states, as part of the prior appropriation doctrine, have felt that's good policy. You want people to improve efficiency. And so you can still take the same amount of water from the river, but you're not returning as much, and you're still within their water right. Well, that's fine until you think about the cumulative effect. The cumulative effect is you have less water downstream, whether it's for a junior water user, for habitat, or for water quality, and we'll see some of the problems that created here. The other thing that's happened is this was adjudicated back in the 1930s, which kind of, as soon as you see that a stream has been adjudicated, you know that at that point there were already arguments over who gets what when. And so it was a heavily developed water in almost any given year, except for a very, very wet year. Junior water users are cut off at some point within the irrigation season. So it is always managed, and the federal water master, appointed by the court, manages the allocation. Well, what junior users have found is as the technology for drilling deep wells and cheap electricity became available, they could supplement their water with groundwater. And what happens is you have a federal court decree with a federal master distributing surface water, and you have groundwater in Nevada that is handled under the prior appropriation doctrine, but handled through the state engineer's office. And so, again, this fragmentation, lack of coordination, and yet the observation in the data assembled by the USGS seems to indicate that this groundwater development was decreasing stream flow within the Walker River. Well, within that Mason Valley, we also have a couple of other water interests. The state had a wildlife management area, has a wildlife management area, and the Yerington Paiute have a small reservation that has irrigation on it. Okay, the river then does this turn to the south, and that's where it enters the Walker River Indian Reservation, which is the larger Indian reservation within the valley. It had at one time actually encompassed Walker Lake, but was smaller at this point. They have a small reservoir on the reservation that's an on-stream reservoir. As we said earlier, the irrigation district's main reservoir is an off-stream reservoir. It's an on-stream reservoir, and it provides irrigation for a little bit on the reservation, but you can see sort of the relative difference in the amount of development. The green here is the irrigation on the reservation, and the green over here is the Mason Valley, the Walker River Irrigation District irrigation. Okay, finally, we're now at the bottom of the river. It terminates in Walker Lake. And at the bottom of Walker Lake is a small community called Hawthorne that it sort of exists for two reasons. One is there's a military base there, the Hawthorne Army Depot, and the other is retirement. People have come here because we have sunshine and water. You know, the thing that seems to draw all of us in retirement to a particular area. And so a lot of interest in the lake, a lot of interest in sport fishing within the lake, within that community. This is just a view of the Hawthorne Army Depot. It's actually, it's a munitions depot that's set up. These are bunkers that store munitions, and they're spread out. This is what we use Nevada for in this country. They're spread out like this so that if one blows up, it doesn't trigger a chain reaction throughout the rest of them. So it uses quite a bit of land, but not very much in terms of water. Nevertheless, their claims were at the table. And if you look at what this southern end of Walker Lake looks like, very arid. Looks very much like, looking out the window here, we get about 4.5 inches of precipitation a year at the lake. So not very much. Okay, so those are the water interests that would be involved in this litigation in federal court. It's already complicated enough, right? We have several military reservations, we have national forests, we have national parks, we have 3 Native American reservations, and we have an irrigation district that spans a state line. But now it actually gets complicated. This is the Lahontan cutthroat trout. It is listed as threatened historically. It was found in Walker Lake, and the cutthroat, what it does is spends its adult life within the lake and then goes up the streams to spawn. A very important sport fishery. This picture is taken somewhere back in the 30s, in 1935. The Weather Dam went in on the reservation, and that stopped the migration of the Lahontan cutthroat trout to its former spawning grounds. And so it's listed as threatened, but it is a completely hatchery-produced sport fishery. So the fish are taken from elsewhere. I think they come from a strain from Pyramid Lake to the north, and then they're planted within the Walker Lake. And you can see this is just a picture of where the Walker River enters Walker Lake. Well, when you have a river that terminates in a lake, nothing leaves that lake. Nothing leaves it except by evaporation. But remember I said 4.5 inches of rain occurs on the lake per year. How much do you think evaporates?
5 feet.
4 feet. Very good, very close. Yes, obviously the consultants in the room noticed this better. Yeah, 4 feet, 4.5 inches of precipitation, 4 feet. If you don't have enough water coming in to make up that balance, your lake level is going to decline. And actually, with these, this is a remnant of a Pleistocene lake that was at one time connected all the way between Walker Lake and Pyramid Lake. So in geologic time, this happens all the time. The lake dries up and comes back. But what's happening now, and I'll show you the graphs on this, is happening in human time, not geologic time. And so this is a graph that shows the volume of the lake sort of since irrigation started upstream. So we have a declining volume within the lake. And another way to see that is with the bathtub reefs around the lake. So you can see how it has declined over the years. What happens when you evaporate water is the water that evaporates is basically distilled. You're not taking any of the salt out, you're leaving it behind, so the salinity is going to go up within the lake. And so what this graph shows is this purple line is the decline in lake elevation, so it's very much like the decline in volume. These other points are the increase in salinity within the lake. So very, very much a correlation with the decline in lake level and the increase in salinity. I don't know if you can read it from back here, but right at this point is 12,000 total dissolved solid. When we were mediating, we were at 15, right up here. Well, another regulatory mechanism. Under the Clean Water Act, states will set water quality standards for a particular water body depending on what the use of that body, and the use has to include listed species. And so the Nevada Department of Environmental Protection had set water quality standards for Walker Lake, as they felt from studies they would be necessary to support Lahontan cutthroat trout. And that level is 12,000 total dissolved solids. So we were well beyond it by the time the mediation was occurring, and we were approaching the point at which the scientists felt that Lahontan cutthroat trout could not survive within the lake. They certainly felt that around 19 or 20,000, the fish there would be no point in planting it. It would be eliminated from the lake. And so you have that problem, but the problem for those who were interested in the sport fishery, and we had a local environmental group that was very much interested in that, the Walker Lake Working Group, and then also Mineral County, which is the county that Hawthorne was in. They were frustrated because under the Clean Water Act, sure, you can set water quality standards at 12,000, but the Clean Water Act regulates discharge. It doesn't regulate the fact that people are taking more water out of the system. Okay, so it doesn't regulate diversion. And so the Clean Water Act was a nice number they got, but not really something that was going to solve the problem. And the listing of the species so far was being handled by basically engineered solutions, by hatcheries. And so the Water Lake Working Group intervened in this federal court litigation asserting the public trust doctrine. So the public trust doctrine, if you're familiar with it, in general, it governs the beds and banks of water bodies that were, we now know, navigable at the time of statehood, at the time that Nevada would have become a state, navigable at that point, and requires that states hold that land in trust for the people. Only one state so far, it happens to be California, has decided that they have to assert continuing jurisdiction over water rights in order to protect a public trust resource. So in other words, that means that they assert, even though a water right has been adjudicated or permitted, that they can reduce it if its exercise is threatening a public trust resource. So Walker Lake is a public trust resource, and as you might imagine, anyone in the West, the way they view California, it would be easy for Nevada to say, oh, yeah, that's California. But geography matters. That case, the public trust doctrine, was at Mono Lake. That was the public trust resource. So this is the drainage just south. The people in these communities know that litigation, know that experience well, and believe very strongly that it is not limited to Mono Lake. And so they were some of the people involved in bringing it here, and the Nevada Supreme Court, several of the justices in dicta on a matter having to do with intervention and not the merits of the case, but in dicta said they would favorably consider the public trust doctrine. And so, and it had never been decided within Nevada. Okay, so let me just summarize this fragmentation of issues that people were facing. So they have settlement of all of the federal Native American water rights. There's a concern about relief for the lake, and the Clean Water Act didn't seem adequate to do it, and so we have, in addition to that, ESA listing and the assertion of the public trust doctrine. We have interstate allocations still pending somewhere out there. We have concerns with conjunctive management of surface water and groundwater, where the surface water is being allocated by the federal court and the groundwater is being managed by the state. And then we have the political fragmentation. We have 2 states, we have 3 Native American reservations, we have 1 irrigation district, 3 counties, an environmental group, and all of them trying to grapple with these problems. One of the things about that litigation, if you're just looking at the water rights, is that the people that already have the water, so the people that have already developed the private interest in water, have no incentive to settle. In fact, they have every incentive to delay litigation if the only thing you're going to talk about in settlement is the allocation of water, because every single claim that's filed is going to reduce the amount of water that they have. So there is no incentive for them to come to the table. But what it turned out in the Walker River was the frustration level was so high with trying to be active at all times on every front. And by active, I mean not just the irrigation district, the tribe, the federal government, the environmental groups, everyone was frustrated with the fact that they sometimes had conflicting things coming out of different processes, and that they had to put forth the resources to be involved in all of them at once. So it's really the chance to put all of this on the table and talk about it in a single forum and talk about a way to coordinate solution that would deal with all these problems that brought people to the table. And I think it helps to look think more broadly, not just about the Water River, but about this decision that people go through when they represent someone and they're trying to decide, are we going to settle or are we going to litigate it? And the first question, of course, in thinking about settling is, what's in it for me? What's in it for my client? And it used to be, I think one of the things that the database on Native American water rights settlements will show is that it used to be what brought people to the table was the prospect of federal dollars. There was actually a term that came to be attached to Native American water rights settlements, which was, the term was wrapping a project in the Indian blanket. And what that meant was that the settlement allowed you to go to Congress for money, and that money would be used to develop water for both the tribe that was party to the settlement, but also for the non-Indians in the area. Well, as time has passed and the Office of Management and Budget was developed, OMB is on to that. And it's no longer happening. It's still very much an issue for tribes in settlement, getting money to develop the water resources. In the Navajo, you have the desire to develop the drinking water system for the reservation. That's still very important, and that's still very much something that you can get even OMB to support. But for anything for non-Indian water development, state and local cost share is going to be looked to. And so that's no longer the reason for people to come to the table. But I think what we're finding, when you look at some of the newer settlements, the Nez Perce is an example of that, the Nez Perce settlement in Idaho, is that the ability to take these issues that just are coming at people from all directions and bring them all into a single forum and say, well, what would work in this basin for solving them, is actually starting to bring people to the table. The other thing, and this sort of leads into one of the reasons why you need a very robust public involvement process. The other thing about litigation versus settlement, how many of you, particularly those of you who are students, have had classes in negotiation? Have you heard the term BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated solution? A negotiated agreement. It's basically what you're supposed to do before you decide, am I going to settle or litigate? And what the books and the classes will teach you is that you're going to go through an analysis of what you think you'll get in litigation. And if you think you can get something better in settlement, you go to settlement. And if you can't get something better in settlement, once you're there, you find that out, you walk away and you go back to litigation. This is not true for public entities. The litigation point is not the point, the walk-away point for public entities. And you can think about it like this. It is a elected public official that is going to have to agree and say, I sign off on this settlement. If signing off on the settlement, even though it's better than what they think they'll get in litigation, is going to be unpopular with their constituents and therefore lead to them not getting elected again, very few elected officials will fall on their sword and actually agree to the settlement. They will leave it to a neutral third party to deliver the bad news to their constituents. And so one of the things that you can do, you can't get the elected official to do something, you go to their constituents, and working with the public can often shift the settlement point to a more rational decision that looks more like, okay, if this is better than litigation, you can agree. The other reason, if you're going to bring other issues onto the table, such as integrating all of these different fragmented regulatory approaches, you're going to have to build it from the bottom up. Doing it from the top down is just going to continue to fragment things as people object to the process. So that brings me to public involvement. You absolutely have to spend the resources to have a very robust public involvement process in a complex negotiation. And there are two main reasons why people don't do it, and they do have validity, and so they're worth talking about. And one of them is you're settling litigation. So people, particularly lawyers, are very concerned with opening up settlement of litigation to the public because they're going to be disclosing confidential information. And the second concern is just the sheer magnitude of it. If you have a populated basin, even if you have a fairly rural population, trying to get your hands around how you organize this is extremely difficult. On the first problem of confidentiality, I think what you have to do is really balance the need for confidentiality against the end goal. And I don't want to diminish that need because what happens in settlement, when you're discussing things within a negotiation, you're governed by the rules of evidence. In this case, it's in federal courts, the federal rules of evidence, and that prevents you from using something in the negotiation against one of the parties if you end up back in litigation. And usually in a negotiation, since you may have people at the table that aren't directly in the litigation, usually you also sign a memorandum of agreement, or you should at the beginning of the negotiation, laying out what the shape of the table is and how you might use information that's exchanged or might not use it in the future. But the problem is you open this to the general public and they're not bound by that. They can use this information in the future. And so that's a real concern, but I think you have to balance that against the idea that you're very unlikely to get to the end point if you don't do it, particularly as this carrot of public money for development has shrunk. You're going to have to involve the public. So it's a balancing act, and you can do things like confidential staff-to-staff discussions on very sensitive issues before they come out in negotiations in order to manage some of that. Well, I want to use this concept of sort of managing things in concentric, ever-widening circles to talk about how you manage the public involvement process. And so what I'm going to do, what I think of this as, is you first have the parties at the table and talk about how you pick who they are. Then the water interests, the basin community, and by the water interests, I don't just mean water right holders. For Walker Lake, this might be someone who owns a sport fishing concession on Walker Lake, something like that. People who have some interest in the water directly. The basin community is the next, and the public at large is the group that's farther out. So we start with the parties at the table, and I think we'll find when we get the database going that there are examples probably that don't go quite this far, but that probably span most of this spectrum. And on this spectrum, a grassroots type of public involvement is where you're truly building from the bottom up. And watershed councils, watershed organizations often are that way. It's not generally common to use that approach when you're settling litigation. One of the problems is the criticisms of watershed councils is that relationships improve, people feel better when they walk out of them, but nothing really happens. But it's also a little bit too unmanageable for the settlement of litigation. At the end, you have the model that I worked under in Montana, where you have the three sovereigns at the table. So you have a federal team, a state team, and a tribal team that are at the table in settling those. And then in different states, there are examples that fall anywhere in between. In Walker River, we had two counties, the environmental group, the irrigation district, the two states, and the federal team wearing two different hats, one for the tribes and one for the other non-Indian reservations. My own experience is that it is more manageable if you have the three sovereigns, not the broader range of interests at the table. And I think you'll see that in sort of the next step in public involvement. I'll explain why I think that is. Next group are the water interests. And again, I define water interests more broadly than people holding water rights. It would be these people that take people down the river on rafts. It would be hydropower interests. It would be fishing interests. Anyone who is directly interested in the water. This group has to be directly involved in the negotiations in some way. You have to work with them. Simply holding a public meeting with these people is not enough. One reason it's not enough is a lot of the places you'd be working in for Native American water rights settlements are rural areas. And in rural areas, people who are involved are overbooked. They already have every night of the week going to a meeting. You can't put additional burdens on them. You have to go to them, go to the conservation district meeting, go to the environmental group meeting, go to the chapter house meeting, whatever it is. You go to the local meetings, you identify leaders that can form an advisory body to the actual people that are at the table. One reason why I say it might be better to have just the sovereigns at the table is there are huge conflicting interests within this group. And you have to have some way to resolve those conflicting interests. And that often works better if it is a smaller process. So it is the state working with its constituents, the tribe working with its constituents to resolve those. And in my experience, those negotiations and that public process with the group immediately interested, you should devote at least twice as much time to that as you're thinking of devoting to actually being at the table with the other negotiating parties. The Basin community, again, is a broader group. It's anyone really interested in the economy of the Basin, in living there, in the aesthetics, any other aspect of the Basin, recreating there, maybe not with respect to water interests, but just interested in the future of the Basin. And it's a little more difficult to find representatives of these groups, but counties, chapter houses come to mind that have the interest of the Basin as a whole. Local congressional leaders, local legislators are also good ones to talk to. You need to be talking to these people throughout the negotiation as well, but they don't quite rise to the level of having an advisory group that you're actually working out positions and getting them to negotiate, facilitating their negotiation with each other. But you do still need contact throughout the negotiation, and one thing to do, we were talking about this the other day, is in the particular basin, start finding out how do people receive their information. Is this a basin where everyone's online? And so you can put up a web page, you can send out an online newsletter and keep people informed of what's going on. Does everybody read the newspaper here? You can put out local press releases. It's just a matter of figuring out how they get their information, how you might post it to them. Finally, you have the public at large, and this is the hardest group to think, how are we going to manage this particular group? But the national interest in sustainability of our water resources is valid. It has to be addressed. These settlements, Native American water rights settlements, go through Congress, and they generally go back to court and are entered in a decree. And both of those are processes in which hearings are held and people can come in and voice what they don't like. But the problem with engaging the general public interest at that point is you usually have such a tightly balanced settlement by then, walking the line between all the parties, that a small objection can upset the apple cart. It is too late at that point. You need to know these things ahead of time. And to the extent that I have ideas on what to do at that time, the best thing you can do is be working with legislative at the state level and congressional leadership and their staffs to be identifying what those interests are. And that isn't just leadership from the basin. That is anybody who has shown a major interest in water. Anyone who serves on a committee that your bill is likely to go to. You don't get control over what committees they go to, but usually Senate Indian Affairs and House Natural Resources are the committees. You work with them with their staffs and tell them the reason you're talking to them is you need to hear from them. Where are the red flags? What do you see in this agreement that could raise objection? And you need to be doing that fairly early within the negotiations to identify those interests. Well, I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. So I'll just wrap up here just to say sort of the two major points is one is settlement's really hard, but it's also an opportunity. It's a huge opportunity to make improvements within a basin, both in the relations and the way that water is managed. And so if you're representing people in these, come to it with that in mind. What can you bring to the table that can make an improvement? And the other message is the absolute importance of involving the public. One other thing I didn't say about the importance of involving the public, not only do you smooth things out for implementation and finalization of the agreement because you've already gotten out all of the concerns that people have, but local knowledge can be extremely helpful. These tend to be tailored solutions. And you may find that something you thought was going to be a big issue is nothing at all, but something else is very important. And bringing in the local community to guide you through that is extremely important. So I'll stop there, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or let you go to the refreshments that Kendall has so graciously put back there. Yeah.
My experience in Arizona is that the settlements between the tribes and the federal agencies and the big water users, those are the three.
Yes.
Right, and the public is not easily at all.
Yeah.
So, I didn't know how to manage something just resolve.
Yeah, and I think the way Arizona has handled it is who is at the table is really determined by who's in the litigation, and that was very much how it was handled on the Walker River. And just going for Montana, you actually have to set up a separate but parallel process in order to do it some other way. So rather than being settlement of litigation, they suspend the litigation, and then the other process goes forward. But I think Arizona has had great success with doing that. I haven't had an opportunity until we get the database up and running to study their settlements to say, are they good settlements? But they certainly have managed to achieve settlement doing it that way. And so, it's another model. It's not one I'd be very comfortable with. Because I think it can come back to haunt you if you haven't considered the other interests.
A little bit about why settlement wasn't due to
Well, to the extent that I can, because they were so unwilling to open the doors, but I can't disclose confidential things. So it was two things. One was, despite a lot of advice to the contrary, they were very skittish about public involvement. And we did press releases to try and manage the chatter that was going on around the basin as to what we were conspiring to do in this room with closed doors. But that did not resolve it, and so you had all of the sort of conspiracy theory things going on about what was happening rose to the level to start to make it uncomfortable for some of the people to be involved. The other thing that happened in Walker River was it was also an unusual settlement in that there was money up front. Senator Harry Reid, who was by then the leader of his party, leader of the Senate, had made it one of his campaign promises to save Walker Lake. And he had really been instrumental in getting the settlements with the Truckee and Carson River. And so he had money appropriated for the Bureau of Reclamation to do a study and start buying water rights and having them go to the lake. And the parties at the table, because of it, and this was really the Department of Justice, their discomfort with negotiating in a room with congressional representatives or their staff, refused to allow his staff into the room. And so they started working some of the parties So some of it was political, but I think if a carefully managed public process had occurred, none of that could have happened because it was really this absence of communication as to what was going on inside and what was possible outside of it.
Is there an example of a public process that's worked outside of Montana? I wonder if there's something,
Something unusual about Montana.
something about the way the Montana process works.
Well, I tried to think about that a lot. Actually, I think Idaho, which took a completely different approach and began with a much more aggressive and much more hostile approach than sort of the touchy-feely thing I was used to in Montana, nevertheless worked. And they had the three sovereigns at the table, Idaho, the Nez Perce, and the federal team. But the state took it upon itself to heavily involve its water users. And actually, my understanding of what happened there was the water users saw the potential to solve broader problems, particularly some of their Endangered Species Act issues, through the negotiations, and they approached the state. Once that happened, though, then it became a very large public involvement process to get there. So I think that just sort of happened organically. That people think, okay, this is the right
I didn't know
thing
there
to do.
was a public involvement.
Pardon?
I didn't know there was a public involvement.
And not a formal one like Montana does, which is more like what I described, but it grew out of that, and it was very, very broad in its input.
I wonder if you have any suggestions. When you have a public like you're going to have in Western Nevada, they kind of hate everybody, especially government sort of people. You know, part of it's outreach, communication, and all that. I mean, how, when you're dealing with such hard knocks, how do you get through that where you actually achieve something as opposed to, well, we did a great public involvement?
Right. I think that you have to always go back, whether you're dealing with people who don't like the touchy-feely aspect of it, or whether you're dealing with people that hate government, or people who love government, you have to always go back to what is it in their interest to do. So, for example, for the Walker River Irrigation District, they, obviously, they had a long history of not wanting government involvement if they actually turned down reclamation funding to develop their water. And so for them, it really had to be what are they going to get for their project? And I think that exists whether the people are hostile or not. No one's going to settle voluntarily if they don't get something they want out of it. And so really focusing on their needs as you work with them and as you help them work with their constituents, their irrigators, is where the dialogue has to go. What do they need to get out of it? I don't know if that is. Yeah.
Is there in the database any kind of assessment of
Oh, good question. Well, so the database, what we have funding for right now is sort of a bare bones. It'll have pre-settlement litigation, settlement, post-settlement decrees, any water codes that come out of it, implementing legislation. And it'll be text searchable and also searchable through a GIS interface. But in terms of the research, what it does is then makes the next phase possible. So once we have this information easily searchable, that's where we'll begin having graduate students and ourselves looking at it and trying to come up with some kind of criteria for when you say a settlement is good or not. One of the concerns, and one of the reasons we really want to get going on that is people have talked about coming up with sort of metrics to analyze settlements. How much water, how much money, how many projects, and when you start talking about solving problems like regulatory fragmentation, there's no metric for that. So we want to think more broadly about the criteria. So as people are going forward, they have a broader sense of what might be good.
Your point about what's in it for the people negotiating brings up the money thing. People complain about OMB for 20 years, but now it's increasingly Congress seems like it's not being willing to put money into these kinds of deals because there seems earmarks or investment or whatever. So if the federal money that has made these deals work in the past isn't going to be there in the future, what makes it work in the future?
Well, and I think that's solving other problems. I mean, they're definitely, you are not going to get these settlements if there isn't at least the political will to fund development of Native American water. And that's sort of a broken promise that is fundamental to these settlements going forward. And people have been, and people in Congress, people at OMB, and people in the interior have been very creative so far at finding ways to deliver on appropriations for that, spreading them out over long periods of time. Some of the recent ones, Navajo would be one, Gila River would be one, have very high sticker shock. And those are going to be hard to get all the appropriations through. And I think going forward, people are going to have to look very carefully at the costs and ways. But in terms of the other users at the table, solving some of the other water problems that they face seems to be, at least in the two settlements, enough to get them to the table.
As with DSA and
As with DSA and yeah. And certainly the irrigators in the Walker River had no expectation of federal dollars. They wanted to have some certainty on how much they had to reduce irrigation to solve these problems. They didn't want to reduce it for tribal development, only to have to come back and reduce it for the ESA, only to have to come back and reduce it because of the interstate allocation. And so just providing that certainty for the people who are economically invested in the water resource can do that. I sure appreciate everyone hanging here for this period of time.
Thank Ross so much for being here with us this semester and for providing us this great presentation tonight. Darcy, I think you've got a little token of appreciation.
Oh! Thank heavens my husband came too.
So, 100 years ago, when I was a lot younger, I met Barb at a Dividing Waters conference. And this is a consortium of judges who get together and talk about water issues. They're in their court. And most judges hate water because it never ends. And they can't talk to anybody else. If you have a water case, you can't talk to anybody else, and nobody else wants to see your face, much less talk about your issues. The consortium came together, and it was really wonderful and dynamic. And I met Barb when she came to talk about the Montana settlement process, and light bulbs were kind of going off in their eyes, and it was really pretty dynamic and wonderful. And she came down to visit family, and she said, let's have lunch. And we said, we really got to work together sometime. Another generation passed.
Dinosaurs, all kinds of things.
And the Winters program, or the Winters conference happened. Utton Center of American Indian Law Institute, American Indian Law Center, and the University of New Mexico and Barb played together. And that's where this idea of the database first arose. And the people attending said, we really, really need this. And I thought, wouldn't that be grand? And it was good to see Barb. And then, a few years later, not quite a generation, I get a call. Darcy, it's Barb. Oh my God, it's Barb. I have this project. It's this database.
manager for a law firm, the largest law firm in New Mexico. Prior to that, I wanted to be a museum curator and take care of collections in the Swedish nation. I thought I got in on that. And then she said, oh, my doctor's waiting. I'm going on sabbatical. I wonder if you might have a little social network. You could be next door. And so this has been such a thrill to have you here, to be able to talk to you, and listen to you. Oh. So, we wanted, the epicenter wanted to give you a little something for being such a champion. And I was going to make a joke about Moscow and red and all that. And then I said, no, I don't think I can pull it off. So, here you are.
And am I
You made it did well.
well, I think we should let people go and go to the refreshments.
So, thank you so much. Thank you.